Good afternoon, folks. I hope you're having a really good day. You're getting an extra video today because I have something to say about quote-unquote race in fantasy and other things. Oh my god, yes, this is going to be a bit of a spicy one. Maybe a spicy take as we go on through the next couple of minutes on the channel. So, no sponsors today. I just wanted to come on and have a little talk about something that I think is very near and dear to my heart, and that is Lord of the Rings, and in question, the new Rings of Power TV series that is about to drop on Amazon over the next couple of weeks, I think. Don't think I'll be watching it. I've watched several of the trailers and read countless, it seems, interviews, because Lord of the Rings is something that's very near and dear to my heart. And so I made sure to do my homework and have a little look at what this show was going to be. And a hobby nightmare story yesterday got me thinking about what I think about race in fantasy and how it should be used and how it shouldn't be used. And a few of my views may be controversial and a few maybe you might agree with, but I ask that you wait until the end of the video to submit your opinions below, tell me what you think, because I'm actually honestly interested in what you guys might be coming across, if you're similar in your thought process to me, or if you're not. So, first things first, I did write a little script for this, but I'm going to be mostly ad hoc, so I've got a few jumping off points that I want to talk about, and towards the end of the video I'll be going into mostly ad-lib territory, because it's something that I wanted to just do off the top of my head, even though I've got a few bullet points here and there. So, first things first, my main thoughts, okay, I just wanted to sum this up straight away, so boilerplate disclaimer of what I think in terms of, so you can, if you want to, you can listen to this and then switch off the video if you don't want to listen to my reasoning at all. So my main thought is, different cultures within a fantasy fiction is a good thing, right? A realistic thing. Something that separates the wheat from the chaff. So if you want a really good fantasy setting, not a book, I'm not saying book, not every book has to be like multicultural, but if you want a really good fantasy setting, something to really get immersed in, different cultures within fantasy fiction is a good thing. A realistic thing. And something that separates the wheat from the chaff in terms of fantasy fiction settings. Blindly replacing the races of characters for a political agenda, however, is the death of creativity and a perversion of the source material in the basest possible way. Alright? If you don't want to hear either of those two points of view explained, in terms of Warhammer and Lord of the Rings, leave now. Okay? Alright. Now that we've got the more squeamish of folks out of the way, hopefully we can get on to talking about what we're here to talk about, and that is 2 points, one on Lord of the Rings and the other on Warhammer. So number one, Lord of the Rings. And I titled this, quite controversially, this point one, and that is, Lord of the Rings is about white people. I'm sorry, but it is, right? Let me explain that. In the Rings of Power, the main race of people from Middle-earth, the area where Gondor, Rohan, the Shire, and Arnor reside, should be mostly racially white and Northern European. So where the Rings of Power is set, which is Middle-earth. Middle-earth isn't the entire world, by the way. People keep saying that Middle-earth is the entire planet. It's not. Middle-earth is just the part where Lord of the Rings takes place. Sort of like Middle-earth, sort of like this planet's version of Europe, right? It's Middle-earth. Right, and on this area, Gondor, Rohan, the Shire, and Arnor, as well as Mordor, but we'll leave them to the side because they're not really, they're not really a race in terms of white, black, or whatever. Gondor, Rohan, the Shire, and Arnor reside here. Arnor's fallen, of course, but this is where we are, and this is a mainly white Northern European setting. Lord of the Rings and its wider world is inspired by Northern European folklore and foundational poems of our culture, Northern European culture, like Beowulf and even the exploits of Arthurian legend. Gondor and Arnor are literal stand-ins for what Tolkien prescribed as the perfect Christian kingdom in the shape of England, essentially. So this is a fantasy England, how England should have been in medieval times in his mind, right? Tolkien was a devout Christian, and he wrote about this a lot, and his faith was very important to him. Folks there, in his faith and in his country, are generally white, and those are the people that he wrote about. The Shire is an almost literal stand-in for rural England and its simple pleasures of folk in these areas, home and hearth and all that, again, typically white. Rohan is quite literally Anglo-Saxons with horses. I've read many essays from Tolkien over the past decade or so. Tolkien spoke at length about how the Battle of Hastings was a tragedy for English folklore and stories, and all of our legends became more Frenchified, more French, with the invasion of the Normans, because they won the Battle of Hastings, and of course, the English court even started to speak French, because the Normans mostly spoke French, right? If the Anglo-Saxons had cavalry at Hastings in Tolkien's eyes, history would have been played out very differently, and we would have kept our traditional Anglo-Saxon Nordic-inspired folklore. Rohan is an answer to that thought process, and again, of course, it is mostly white. Alright? So that's what I'm getting across when I'm trying to tell you that this is a setting that is about white people. I apologise. Look, I'm not the person going into Black Panther and saying we should have more white people in here, because that's bullshit, right? It's based on, African tribes, African legends, and all that sort of stuff. I don't have a say in that. You go for it, right? I watched it. It was very good, right? But Lord of the Rings is just about white people. I'm sorry, it is. It's just about white people. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with us having our own foundational myths without them being perverted by social justice politics, right? We can have our own thing, it's fine, okay? Cool. Right, moving on. And I will bring all this back together. I know this sounds very controversial, and I want to jump in now to defend my points, but I'm going to lay them all out first, and I'll defend them at the end, okay? So, point 2 is Warhammer. Both of them, 40k and fantasy. Age of Sigmar 2 a little bit. I define this as a grey area. So Lord of the Rings is about white people. It just is, right? Most of it. Obviously, we have all the cultures in there as well, right? But Tolkien never wrote about those cultures. Well, hardly ever wrote about those cultures, right? They weren't really interesting to him. I'm willing to bet that if he was alive today, Tolkien would have taken places like Rum and places like that and given them over to people from those backgrounds and be like, hey, why don't you guys write this? Why don't you guys write that? I don't have any experience of that. I have experience of being a Northern European and being very proud of being English and Northern European. Well, I can't be proud of being where you're from, which is why I didn't expand on those areas. So why don't you do it, right? Tolkien was that kind of a person. He wanted people to come into Middle-earth and fill it out with their own art, stories, poems, songs, whatever, right? Of course, he would have liked you to stay in your lane, right? So don't just start changing the source material, because that's bullshit, right? That's what the Rings of Power is. But he would have said, look, I don't want to write about these cultures because I'm not from these cultures. Why don't you write about these cultures, right? Brilliant. I would love that. I would love it if the Rings of Power was based in with the Haradrim, like if we're going with some Haradrim tribes and things like that, with these massive monolithic mega elephants fighting wars out there in the steppes, or in this settings version of Africa. I'd love that. That's my shit right there. I'd love that. I love exploring different cultures through fantasy and things like that. I would love that. Brilliant, right? Perverting Middle-earth itself to chase an agenda isn't. That's a typical Amazon thing to do. But anyway, moving on. Part 2, Warhammer. A grey area. Warhammer and Warhammer 40,000, for me, are products of their times. They were created long before the explosion of far-left ideology, where everybody with a GCSE in history could create their own settings, right? That was just back in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. Both settings grew like embryos, and were written mostly by white British authors and their takes on foreign cultures. If you want to know how lazy and awful some of these writers were, well, the Space Wolves and White Scars exist. No hate on either for wishing to stick to history, but both are blatant transportations of one thing to another with little to no nuance. History to 40k, subtle as a brick. Literally. Subtle as a brick. Space Wolves are Vikings, White Scars are Mongols. They're just in space now. That's it. If you have a GCSE in history, you can write for Warhammer 40,000 back in the day, right? That's how... Which is one of the reasons why I quite like the Horus Heresy books, or at least what they're trying to do, and giving these people depth, giving their cultures depth. But there's only so much you can do when their cultures have been memeified to such an extent. So, the same can be said of Warhammer Fantasy. It's a grim, dark take on Norse raids, the late Holy Roman Empire, Northern European folklore, and other pieces like that. It is very telling that the lore of places like Spain and Italy in Warhammer Fantasy are almost overlooked by the Warhammer writers, criminally so in my opinion, as Warhammer writers are British, and a lot of the time we do feel weird writing about more romantic Latin places. We do. As an English writer, I know many other English writers, we do. We just are weirded out by romance and the Southern European style of doing things. We just find it very strange, right? We are Northern European. Our comfort zone in terms of writing is cold, raids, and order rather than art, philosophy, and romance. Okay? That's why places like Tilia and Estelia and people like places like that in Warhammer aren't really covered that much because the writers aren't from those places. Go figure. The same way Tolkien didn't write about Rum or about the Harrowdrim that much, right? He's not from those places, so he doesn't want to inject himself into those places and start having these out-of-body experiences on behalf of other people, right? It's not right. They should write about those things, okay? But here's another interesting point that I've come across in my time having a little look at Warhammer and how things are going with the setting and stuff like that. Warhammer and Warhammer 40,000 are strangely very representative of folks, but mostly 40k. I believe this is because Warhammer Fantasy was abandoned at the beginning of this ultra-left-leaning phase in society as a whole. Look at Age of Sigmar, if you don't believe me. Half of the Stormcast Eternals are either women or not white when painted by the heavy metal team. And there's nothing wrong with this, by the way, because the lore backs up that the Stormcast Eternals are from all races and creeds. So, have at it. They can be whatever colour you want, because the lore backs it up, right? They haven't just wishy-washied something together and said, they're all black now, or they're all Chinese now. No, they've said, look, they can be from anywhere. We've written that into the lore. So there you go. And they can be women, too. We've written that into the lore. Foundationally, it's there. No worries, right? Salamanders 2 and armies like them in 40k have been tailor-made for this kind of great inclusivity. Sisters of Battle are also a slick and wonderful army to paint and play for those seeking female representation in the Imperium. For those wanting representation in the Xenos, look no further than the million different shades of Eldar that we have, and of course the androgynous hordes of Tyranids and Necrons and the like. 40k is already, in my opinion, going above and beyond in terms of representation. What other setting do you know that is kind of dominated by men, and white men for the most part, is so inclusive as 40k? 40k is ridiculously inclusive. It already has a width and breadth of depth. For people who want to come in from different cultures and find themselves in Warhammer 40,000, there's always something for you, and if it's not there, then make it, right? I'm not Japanese. Go figure, right? But the Astral Blades are based a lot on Japanese folklore. Now imagine, I don't know anything about being Japanese, but as I said before, like, anybody with a GCSE in history can write Warhammer 40k lore and just inject a little bit here and a little bit there. Imagine being actually Japanese, looking at Warhammer 40,000 and going, I'm going to create a Space Marine chapter about my own culture. You could do that, and it would fit in to the Warhammer 40,000 wider hemisphere of lore. It would fit in so well with that, right? You could do it if you're Chinese, you could do it if you're from Nigeria, you could do it if you're from Argentina. You could figure out something and inject it into Warhammer 40,000, and it just works, right? The only things that don't work is a base changing of the lore, the foundational lore of Warhammer 40,000. Don't change that. Build on top of it, but don't change it, right? All the Lord of the Rings is, and was meant to be, all Warhammer 40,000 is, and was meant to be, is a foundation block. It's the foundations of a house. How you build that house on top of those foundations is up to you. But do not change the foundations, because if you change the foundations, the whole thing's liable to fall down like a house of cards. Literally, okay? Alright. So, into my third point. So what's good and bad in my opinion? And I'd like to tell you about a fictional character, one of my favourite fictional characters, called Apollo Creed. I bet you didn't see that one fucking coming, did you? So when I was a kid, I really loved the Rocky films, mainly because I was a huge wrestling fan. And I couldn't really get into boxing because even though boxing is a science and an art in itself, it is very touchy-feely, feeling each other out. It's not Hollywood, right? To me, wrestling was Hollywood. And, you know, you could easily understand it as a young man watching it. The same goes for Rocky. All Rocky is boxing, but with a wrestling storyline pasted over the top of it. A very good wrestling storyline pasted over the top of it that's been used in New Japan Pro Wrestling no fewer than 7 times at this point, but I digress. Moving on. Apollo Creed is my favourite character in Rocky, and probably one of my favourite characters in the entirety of stories. If I think of a champion, I think of Apollo Creed. If I think of what a champion's supposed to look at, I think of Apollo Creed. I think of Carl Weathers when he was 25, 26. You know, 6'4", chiseled, in a suit, wearing immaculate clothes. And you know what? He's sitting at a desk for most of that movie. He's fighting as well, but he's also sitting at a desk talking about different things. I want to talk to you about my favourite scene in Rocky, and probably one of my favourite scenes in cinematic history too. It is in Rocky 2. And it is when Apollo Creed is talking to his management team about wanting a rematch with Rocky. Now, if you know any of the story about Rocky, in the first movie, Rocky loses. He loses because Apollo Creed beats him on points. But Rocky is a no mark. No one knows who he is. And so Apollo Creed, it sort of thinks, I kind of lost, you know? I beat him, but, you know, I won, but I kind of lost. And when his manager says, his manager knows Rocky can beat him. His manager knows Rocky can beat Apollo Creed. He goes over to Apollo Creed and says, this man ain't no good for us, baby. He's no good for us. We need to go and face somebody else. He's done. We've beaten him. You know, you won. You won. And Apollo Creed slams his fist down on the table and says, but I didn't beat him. Yeah, I won, but I didn't beat him. I didn't beat the man. And that is a champion's response. And that's something that I've carried with me throughout my entire life. That kind of... I've always wanted to reiterate that determination in everything that I do. I try to. I fail most of the time. But I always try to have that kind of... Look. If you look at Carl Weathers' face, that clip is on YouTube. Go and find it. You look at Apollo Creed's face when he's looking at his trainer. He says that, but I didn't beat the man. That's a champion. That's what a champion's supposed to look like. Right. Let me get back to my point on Apollo Creed. If they remade the Rocky franchise and they made Apollo Creed white, I would be absolutely fucking furious. Because Apollo Creed, the whole point of why Apollo Creed is so determined to win and so determined to beat Rocky and to be the champion that everyone can look up to is because he comes from nothing. He comes from the 70s era black neighborhoods that are in the midst of a heroin pandemic, and which is mostly government funded, by the way. And he has come from an absolute destitute background, and he's fought his way to where he is now. And he's determined to drag people up there with him. That is part of his core representation of who Apollo Creed is. If you make him white, you strip him of about 70% of his power as a character. It is a bastardization of his character, and there is no way that it should stand. Right? That's what I think about changing people's races for political means. It's a disgrace. Now let me just flip that around onto Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power at the moment has been but showing you dwarves that are black and female, or elves that are black, or, you know, or Asian, or from all these different backgrounds and cultures. I'm sorry, that's not what Lord of the Rings is. If you want to call something the Rings of Power and set it somewhere else in Tolkien's world, that's fine. Setting anything in Middle-earth automatically means that most of the people in that setting, in that story, will be white. If you change those things, all you're doing to me is you're waving a white flag and saying most of this show will be full of modern-day politics. And let me tell you something about Lord of the Rings and modern-day politics. Tolkien fucking hated modern-day politics in his stories. People said to him, they tried to tell him that the One Ring was an allegory for nuclear weapons. And do you know what he said? It bloody well isn't. I don't like allegory. I've detested it since I've grown old enough to detect it and wise enough to detect its presence. It's not for me. I don't like it, and I don't want it in my stories or settings. That's what Tolkien said. He doesn't want it in his settings. He's rolling in his grave looking at shit like this that Amazon are doing to his setting. I'm telling you now. And that is why changing people's races for a political agenda is a bad sign. It's a bad thing. Don't do it. The one thing you should do is aim for inclusivity. And that's exactly what Warhammer 40,000 has done. Right? That is exactly what Warhammer Age of Sigmar has done. And you know what? A lot of things are doing it in the right way these days. We should celebrate these things. We shouldn't demand that we have female space marines. We shouldn't demand that most of the characters in the Rings of Power should be of a different race other than white. Because apparently we're whitewashing our own history. We can't whitewash white history when it's fucking made by white people. Right? You can't whitewash the Battle of Hastings. Because everybody there was a white person. That's not how... Anyway... That is what I think about the new Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power. I will watch the first episode just to say that I've seen it and I can have an opinion now. But I'm telling you now, I am not impressed with the way that they are going about it. I think since Christopher Tolkien died, the grandchildren of Tolkien are raping his legacy. And I don't mean that. I mean that in exactly how I say it. You know, they are taking his legacy and they are selling it like a whore on a street corner to the highest bidder, and it's disgusting. I hate it, and Amazon can go fuck off, right? Anyway, that's my opinion on injecting race issues into fantasy. Again, inclusivity, great. Forced inclusivity, bad. What do you guys think? I'd really love to hear what you have to say in the comments down below. Thank you very, very, very much for watching, and I sincerely hope that, you know, you have a good day, and, well, that you have a good day. Have a good one, guys. Love you loads. See you later. Bye.